Okay, so today we're moving on to subsistence strategy number 2, which is horticulture. And in case I did not mention this in the last class, the reason I'm going in this order is because foraging is the oldest known subsistence strategy. That means that foraging is the reason why you and I are here today, because humans were successful at surviving through foraging for all of human history up until that 12,000 year mark that we were just talking about, where archaeologists find that sedentary villages started to happen and people were in one place for a while, and we know that because of the remains that they left behind, the artifacts and the trash and stuff like that archaeologists can analyze for how old it is and what were the human activities that were going on in a place. So 12,000 years ago, there is archaeology evidence that a different type of subsistence strategy was being used by human populations. And so I believe that I am out of order in how the book presents these subsistence strategies to you. I think, yes, okay, pastoralism is next. The reason I am reordering them than the book is because horticulture is the next chronologically. You know that word chronologically, like in date order? So foraging is the oldest. I'm doing horticulture next because it is the next oldest subsistence strategy in human history. Okay? So, horticulture. Can y'all see that marker? Horticulture. Now, I think I mentioned to you all at the end of the last class that if you're looking foraging up on Google or something to find an outside source for a reaction paper, if you're looking it up, be careful to make sure that you look it up, that you find a source that discusses it in the way we discussed it in class, because you will find a lot of modern day sources that use the word foraging in a modern sense, or I shouldn't use the word modern, I should say in an industrialized sense, like you and I live in an industrial subsistence strategy. A lot of sources are gonna say that foraging is part of industrialism. Well, that's true. That's something that maybe wasn't on your list about foraging. That we should have closed with on Monday. We should have said that foraging is not only the original subsistence strategy, like I just said, but it's also part of every single one of the next 4 subsistence strategies too, okay? So just because horticulture is our next subsistence strategy in time, in population density, and a whole bunch of progressions that we're going to look at, or increases that we're going to look at, it is also one of those words that when you look it up online, we use horticulture in a lot of, the word horticulture in a lot of different academic disciplines and in a lot of ways still today in industrialism, okay? So let me tell you what it is in anthropology. And then I'll tell you like how some other fields like biology or botany, for instance, a field that I love botany. Anyway, botany uses the word horticulture in a different way than we talk about it in anthropology. Okay, so horticulture is, it's a subsistence strategy that is small scale production of crops, plants, small scale production of crops with only hand tools and manpower, not complicated machines, not beasts of burden. Do y'all know that,
Yes.
that phrase? Beasts of burden means an animal that you make work for you. So, for instance, an ox that you put a harness on and you make the ox pull the plow, you don't have an ox doing your gardening for you. You are doing your gardening for everybody in the community, okay? So small scale production of crops with only hand tools and manpower, no beasts of burden, Here is a phrase that is also, I want to mark that phrase, be subverted, as just a very good college level phrase for you to know. Okay, it's just for you to know what that is when somebody talks about it. No be subverted, and with very limited, with a very limited toll on the environment, with a very limited manipulation of the environment. Horticulture. Okay. When I say small scale here, what I include in the meaning there is that in horticulture, no surplus is produced. So there is no focus on surplus. What did we say surplus means? Extra. So the small scale production of crops that your community engages in collectively together. It's not a one person's endeavor and another person's endeavor and you're taking care of each of your families independently. The entire horticulture community works together to produce all of the plants that are necessary to feed all of the people in the village for a particular period of time. Okay? And let's say that the particular period of time is 1 year. Okay? So obviously, depending upon what the crop is or crops, sometimes horticultural communities focus on just one main crop and one main crop only. A staple, you've heard that word before, a food staple, like rice or potatoes or corn is a food staple. So sometimes horticultural communities focus on just one particular crop, like the Yanomami that you read about. They focus on the plantains that we're talking about and some kind of tuber. What was the tuber called? I think the article you read was just about the plantains. But anyway, so sometimes horticultural communities focus on just one particular crop, but sometimes there's a variety of crops, okay? And all of the men, for instance, the division of labor is that men are the ones who actually do the work that's associated with crop production, for the most part, and females do the work that's associated with domestic life, for instance, caring for elderly, caring for young, processing the food, fixing, cooking the food, that kind of stuff, and also foraging activities. Men and women both will be engaged in foraging activities. So, for instance, when the article said that the Yanomami produce these plantains and that's their main source of food, that's not the only thing that they eat. There's foraging activities that also bring calories into the community as well, right? Okay, so there's no surplus produced. That means still that food does not have a price tag, okay? Back on Monday when we put making a living on the board for the first few minutes of class, and we said, what does that mean? And you were like, bills and buying stuff and, buying food and paying rent and stuff like that. You are not paying for food in a horticultural community, just like you're not paying for food in a foraging society. Food is something that is seen in your enculturation process. You understand. You think of food. Food symbolizes, to use the word symbol from chapter 2, food symbolizes something that is a basic human right. In a foraging society, land, access to land, and the food that the land provides is seen as a basic human right. I mean, the word human right might not be in the vocabulary of a horticulturalist or a forager, but food does not have a price tag that I'm going to withhold food from you when you need it because you have to pay me or trade me something for it. That concept doesn't exist in these kinds of communities, okay? So, as I mentioned, the division of labor. The division of labor in a horticultural society, we cannot call it egalitarian because there is a greater division of labor in a horticulture society than there is in foraging. So it's not egalitarian, but it's also not wealth and poverty. It's also not this racial group and this racial group. It's not these huge divisions. The division of labor is that males, active middle-aged males, do the work directly related to food production, to the staple food production. Okay, so males do the work, particularly middle-aged, able-bodied males, not too young, not too old to be able to do strenuous work, because this is about hand tools and manpower, and you do not manipulate the environment very much. So we're going to talk about how that is definitely possible to do without that bright blue Miracle Grow that some of us might use, right? They don't have bright blue Miracle Grow to add to the environment to make sure that they get the same number of potatoes this year as they got last year. But they have to worry about stuff like that. You have to know about how do I make sure I have a sedentary village, which means I'm in one place. How do I make sure that if I have 175 people in my village, how do we make sure that all of those 175 people are going to get the food that they want year after year, right? Without your potatoes decreasing and decreasing and decreasing because you're depleting nutrients from the soil or something, right? So we have, there's a lot of work involved. When I say that you have very limited manipulation of the environment, that takes a heck of a lot of work on your part. That you don't have to manipulate the environment in harsh ways, okay? So males do the work directly related to the staple food production, and females do the secondary work. So what I mean by secondary work here, secondary work would be, and you can include this in your notes also, the secondary work would be certainly childcare and certainly elder care if any of that was necessary. Certainly food processing, cooking. You might do a lot of hunting and gathering yourself because foraging is going to be one of the ways, not the main way, but one of the ways that you get calories in your horticulture society is through foraging also. Okay? So females are going to do hunting and gathering both, and males are going to do literally the my grandmother would say the elbow grease labor. Y'all know that phrase, elbow grease. The hard work associated with working the field, making the land soft enough to plant things in it. Right? When you're doing this by hand, that's hard. That's hard work. Okay. So anyway, and the males will also do some of the hunting and gathering, some of the foraging activities also. Okay? So you get calories from both sources, but the difference in a horticulture society is that your main source of calories comes from the foods that you are intentionally producing. Do foragers intentionally produce food? No. Foragers do not save seeds from one season to the next so that they can plant more of a plant than would naturally occur in that area anyway. Madison, put your phone away or whatever it is. Like all the way away so you're not tempted again. Everybody else make sure your phones are off. Okay. So, so the horticulturalist does that kind of thing. They're going to save seeds from one planting season to the next. They're going to save, spuds Is that what you call for potatoes when you're gonna plant them again? You're going to save and preserve those kinds of things in your enculturation process. You're going to have a really, really high level of knowledge about how best to preserve seeds, save them. You're going to have a really high level of knowledge about what plants grow 12 months out of the year. Right? So for instance, in Arkansas, you know, where we are, not all plants grow 12 months out of the year, right? So you would learn about all the different species and varieties of plants that you could plant so you could eat 12 months out of the year. Okay? You know, or maybe you plant the bulk of your crops during the spring, summer, and fall, and then maybe you plant certain things that preserve well through the winter so you have plenty to eat through the winter when nothing else is growing. But you don't produce that extra because you're going to go sell it. That concept doesn't exist. You produce that extra in the summer and the fall because you know it's got to last you through the winter until the spring. Right? Okay. So there's no surplus, and you do have a different social stratification. Did I use that term with you on Monday, social stratification? Okay, so let me use that now. It has to do with this division of labor thing, and it is the topic from chapter 7 or 8 or something like that. So I'm bringing in some information from one of those two chapters. Those two chapters are going to be incorporated into the next few class discussions quite a bit anyway. So anyway, let me just get some space on the board, and we'll talk about social stratification. Okay, so here's how you spell that word. If I get the spelling right, you know me. Okay, social stratification, something that is stratified. Y'all know what that word means? It means layers. Good guess, but no, it means layers. Stratification, like just the other day I was in a different classroom. I was in like the earth science classroom, and they had on the board the different layers of the atmosphere. They were talking about that, right? The one that's closest to the earth, and then all the way up into the stratosphere or whatever, right? Do y'all know the order of them? Troposphere, mesosphere. Ionosphere, there's one of them. Right, so see, y'all are at least vaguely familiar with the fact that we have different layers in the atmosphere, and even the Earth's crust, right? Like we have bedrock and then whatever else, I don't know, I know bedrock, right? Okay, so stratification, that word comes from the natural sciences, and we use it in the humanities and social sciences to refer to inequality among people in a population, okay? So egalitarianism, when we used that word on Monday to describe foragers, I should have introduced this word to you, or this concept to you then, because egalitarianism is a type of social stratification. Egalitarianism is descriptive word for what kind of inequality does or doesn't exist in a particular society. Foraging is egalitarian. Everybody's almost equal, but not quite, right? Everybody's almost equal because the work that they do has the same social value. The work that they do results in food for everybody. So males that do hunting for the most part, females that do gathering for the most part, both of those different work types result in food for everybody. So that has the same social value, but not exactly the same division of labor. So that's why we say egalitarianism in foraging. We do not have egalitarianism in horticulture. We have social stratification, which is inequality among the population. Inequality among groups in a population, and in the case of horticulture, social stratification is based on gender. Gender and able-bodiedness. Sorry, I'm standing right in front of it. Based on gender, because that division of labor that I just described to y'all, where males are doing the bulk of the work associated with the bulk of the calories that the entire community needs. Females are doing the bulk of the work associated with processing and distributing and childcare and elder care, things that are necessary for the survival of the community, but they are secondary to the food production. Yes?
You said it's also based on the physical build?
Yeah, gender and very secondarily the age of somebody. Because, I mean, we're going to still take Grandpa out with us, and I'll explain to you, like, what a day in the life of a guy is in horticulture and a day in the life of a gal in horticulture in just a second. But, yeah, gender first, and then secondarily, your ability to work, which you can associate with, like, with your age category. Very secondarily, age. Because again, even if Grandpa is too feeble, or whatever word you want to use, even if Grandpa is too feeble to actually help me hoe the field with my digging stick and, you know, move rocks or pull tree stumps out, if that's too laborious for Grandpa now, Grandpa has all the knowledge about how best to do these things. Grandpa has all the knowledge about how did we, you know, what did we do that year when for some reason our crops got some kind of like fungus on it or something and some of them died. Like, he'll remember all of those tricks of the trade. And so Grandpa still has a very high social value because he has all that information. And so if Grandpa can't go with us anymore to go out and work the field, he can stay home with the youngsters. And what's he doing with the youngsters while he's home with them? Teaching them everything. Teaching them everything through telling them stories about what he's done in his life, through making the digging sticks that the guys need to actually, you know, pry stumps out of the ground or something like this. Grandpa is staying home teaching the kids how to make the tools that they need to be successful horticulturalists and teaching them all the tricks that he's seen in his long life. So Grandpa has still a very high social value. It's mostly gender that the division of labor is based on, okay? Mostly gender. And, you know, and the women, Grandma too. Grandma's home teaching the little kids, this is how we supplement the guys, the work that the guys do, right? So Grandma has a relatively high thing. Okay, so social stratification. So yeah, egalitarianism is the pattern in foraging, and gender is the main focus of social stratification. It's not about ownership. Just like in foraging, there's no ownership of land. There's no ownership of that canoe that you hewn out of a tree or whatever. There's no ownership of that. It was made for the benefit of the entire community. And horticulture has that same concept, okay? So in horticulture, there is no land ownership. No land ownership. There is generally an understanding that a particular area is available for community use, okay? So land has like community access to land, community access to land, but there's not like a records, there's not like some big city someplace. Cities don't exist really in a purely horticultural society, okay? I'm talking about like 12,000 years ago when we first find out that this is happening. I'm in that time set right now. So in that time set, you did not have some county capital someplace where you could take your, you know, where you could take your survey map and get it registered, and everybody now knows that that territory is yours. No, nothing like that, okay? You have a certain population density. So population density, what does that mean?
How many people within the land can support?
Yes, how many people are within a certain unit of land? Yeah, okay. So population density is higher than foraging. You can let it get higher than foraging. Anybody know why you can let it get higher?
And they're not moving constantly?
Okay, so the more access to food, they're
Also,
not moving constantly because
They farm their own.
because they
They
yeah.
have their own seeds.
Right. They have their own seeds and they're going to farm. So they have more access to food. What did you say, Hunter?
Oh, that's basically what I was going to say, is that since they're manipulating the land more, they're able to produce more, therefore they're able to take care of more people.
They have a more predictable food supply. Yeah. So with foragers, we talked about how they were very conservation they had a very conservation mindset. If you know that the population of deer in your area is going to have maybe only 30 babies a year or something, and you're not the only kind of animal in that area that eats the deer, and sometimes deer die from natural causes, then you're probably not going to take more than 5 or 6 deer in that cycle, that reproduction cycle, to conserve the population, right? You're not going to overtax it. But you never know. Like this, deer flu might come through and all of them die or something. Very many of them die, right? Like you never know. You don't have as much food security as a forager because you are limited to what the environment is doing. Like the environment is in control. So you are manipulating the environment enough here to have a better grasp on the amount of food that you are going to consistently have available throughout the year. Okay? So yes, your population density can go up. And another reason your population density can go up is because you are sedentary. Now you're in one place, and so it is easier to have babies and raise them up because the calories, a female has to have a lot of calories to bring a baby to life, and then we have to feed them once they're here, right? And you have to have a lot of calories to produce enough milk to bring them up in a healthy way. So there's much more predictable source of calories here, and so you can have more babies at any given time in a horticulture society, so the population density goes up. You're still going to control birth rates though, because there's a cap to this, right? Yes, sir.
Since we're no longer nomadic, are we building like more permanent structures?
Yes, and we're no longer nomadic, we're sedentary, so we're going to build more permanent structures, and that's one of the reasons why we find evidence in the archaeology record as far back as 12,000, 13. I've seen 13,000, I've seen 11,000. I usually just hit it at 12,000 years ago because you can see foundations sometimes, left behind, or we can see like evidence that a certain place within a foundation perimeter had a hearth where like a fire was burned over and over and over again,
So
right?
is this also the mentality of like it takes a village still present, or is it more shifting toward the monogamous sort of thing at this period, or is that? Like,
Oh, okay. Good question. So, no, we are not going to bring in just yet ideas of polygamy or monogamy for like nuclear families or extended family units. That's a good thought and connection to make, but we will talk about that. We're going to talk about that a little bit in chapter 6 when we talk about economics, because like the way families or kinship groups in general share resources is an economy. So we'll get to that. So good thinking, but keep that question for like chapter, I don't know what chapter it is, 8 or 9 or something like that. Okay. So there, at this point, for what we know about foraging and what we know about horticulture, you can't safely make an assumption that there would be monogamy or polygamy in these, because we don't have enough information yet.
Well, I mean, with foraging, it's mostly thought that men have multiple different like wives, or
Not necessarily.
Not
that
wife,
can't.
I'm
We
just using
cannot.
that as a,
Yeah, we cannot jump to that conclusion. That's not a correct conclusion. And this is to say, oh well, they're in one place, so they must only have one husband and one wife now. That's not a correct conclusion to make. But it's a good line of thought. So I'm glad that you brought that question. But we'll talk about that later. Okay. So yes. So social stratification in general, we're going to talk about that with each of these subsistence strategies. Okay. So let's talk about the kinds of activities that males in the society, able-bodied males, to go back to what Kai was saying, able-bodied males are doing on a daily basis in a horticultural society. Okay, so let me draw a general community access plot of land, okay? So here's my, isn't it gorgeous? Here's my community access plot of land, okay? So there is no fence around this, and there is no map that draws where your community's land is compared to my community's land. But here's my community right down here, and here's a little river that meanders through, and that's one of the reasons why I really liked that spot for my sedentary village, because here's a nice little river that runs through it. Okay? And so this is where the community is, and this is a whole bunch of land, much more land than you need on a yearly basis to cultivate so that everybody in this tiny little village over here gets food. Okay? Remember, you're not producing surplus. So all of this is not in production at the same time. But still, all of this is generally understood that the community has access to all of this. So, the men, in your subsistence strategy, part of the plan for producing food is which part of this community's access to this land, which part are we going to cultivate right now for use during this time period, a 3-year time period or something, okay? You can't always, maybe right now we're going to use closer to the river. Okay, so here is the area that Bethany wants to cultivate for this 3-year period. We only need about this much area to cultivate all of the crops that we need to feed all of us for 12 months. All of the rest of this we leave alone. Okay? All of the rest of this is fallow land. This is production land. Okay? That's all we need to feed the village. What's the word fallow mean? Have y'all heard that word before? Fallow is not in production. Fallow you leave to the earth. You leave to natural processes. Okay? So we said that there is very limited manipulation of the environment. Fallow land is left untouched. You leave it untouched. It goes back to nature.
Would they still hunt that land?
Absolutely, sure. Sure. Going back to nature means that all kinds of critters and all kinds of plants take over that you had to, when it was in production, you had to remove all that because you have to cultivate the earth in order to make sure that, you know, you can plant your crops, right? Okay, so right now, in this 3-year, 5-year period, whatever the year period is, this is what we were producing. The prior 3-year period, we were in this plot. Prior to that, we were in that plot. Prior to that, we were here. Prior to that, here. You see the pattern? Okay? So every time we need land, I think I'm going to sneeze. Thank you. Okay. So every time we need land to produce an anticipated yield of crops, we have to be able to anticipate what the yield of our crops is going to be, because we have a certain number of people to feed, maybe 175, 250 people, somewhere in there. All those people got to eat all the year long, right? So we have to anticipate the yield, and in horticulture, there are no artificial fertilizing techniques. None. No artificial fertilizing techniques. None of that bright blue Miracle-Gro stuff. You also do not have animals. Remember, I emphasized you are producing plants here. You don't have back at the village a herd of goats that you collect their manure and add to the ground. You don't do that. There is some evidence that some horticulturists did have like a few animals that they might keep, but there wouldn't be enough manure or waste to fertilize all of this land all of the time. not from the very few animals that you might in your village keep. That's not the main source of calories. In horticulture societies, plants are the main source of calories. Okay, so there's no artificial fertilizing techniques. So this, letting the land lie fallow, untouched, going back to nature, this is your fertilizing technique. This is the limited manipulation that you do to the environment. So, you know, we keep on going back in time. It maybe has been 47 years since your village last used this little section of land. What has happened to that plot? And when they were using it, it was ground. It was open ground that was hoed up with their hand tools. It was all soft dirt that they could pick weeds out of and plant plants and walk through row crops or however it was organized. That's what this looked like. In 47 years, what has happened to that land if it has been fallow?
It's back to normal.
What do you mean by normal?
Covered in
The nutrients in
land.
the soil.
It's covered in
Bushes.
grass and weeds and bushes and trees, and raccoon families have moved in there, and they are peeing and pooping and dying and rotting and bringing in fish from the river and eating them and dropping fish guts, and that's been rotting, and leaves have been falling and that's been rotting, and earthworms are in it, and groundhogs, et cetera, like that's what's been happening. So whatever nutrients were depleted out of the soil by the last time we planted crops on this particular plot, whatever nutrients were depleted, all of the animals and the plants that have grown in it since then have put different types of nutrients back into the soil. Birds flying over and pooping, and feathers falling and decaying, and all of those kinds of things have nutrients in them that add minerals and vitamins and all kinds of stuff to the soil that a potato plant needs, or a plantain crop needs, or whatever. Okay, so this fallow land is a very low impact environmental thing, because even though it started out vacant and you had to do some major alterations to it to get all those trees and the tree stumps and the all that kind of stuff, you had to do some major alterations to get rid of those. After you use it for a while, you're going to let all that stuff grow back again. Okay? Yes.
Might be a dumb question. I know Washington Carver more popularized the idea of crop rotation, but was there any evidence?
That is an agriculture technique for the most part. But yes, you would probably, if you're using this for 5 years, whatever your time period is, which would have developed over your village's history, like you would have a custom where the guys would know we're going to use this for X number of years, right? So maybe, if there are multiple crops that you produce, then crop rotation absolutely would be a logical thing to do. I'm going to plant my corn here and my sweet potatoes here and my tomatoes here or whatever, and then next year I'm going to flip those, because you're right, peanuts take something out of the soil that corn doesn't and the tomatoes need, or, So the crop rotation, or switching the location for each of your crops within that time period, would absolutely be a behavior that, the folks in the village would
I just wasn't
develop
sure.
over time.
I just wasn't sure if they were doing that simply switching the plots of land.
Oh, absolutely. You're going to do everything that you can, everything you can have control over in a natural way without that artificial fertilizer technique. Okay? So in 47 years, however long, I don't know why I picked 47, but that's our number that we're going with. But in 47 years, all those big things have grown up, and all the animals have moved in and out, and there have been a lot of nutrients replenished in that soil. So, okay, we're on this corner up here. And by the way, this isn't too far from the river to haul some water. But also, there's no artificial irrigation techniques, no complex irrigation.
We can figure out aqueduct shed.
Are there 2 R's in that word?
Irrigation, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So okay. Are you sure? It looks funny. Anyway. Okay. Good. So irrigation. So no complex irrigation techniques.
Is it an A before the G?
I'm sorry.
Is it an A before the G?
I don't know. Y'all just spell it right. Spell it right in your notes. I'm so sorry. I'm the world's worst speller. So, anyway,
Yeah, IRRIGATION.
Okay, good. So no complex irrigation techniques, and so what that means is maybe some of the job that you have to do when you're using these plots of land over here is, haul water from the river, but no, you're not even building a canal. You're not building or digging, a ditch where the water will unnaturally flow. Most likely you're not. You are, you put up things to collect rainwater to use, and you haul water when necessary. But you're not going to do any kind of complex thing to artificially bring water to your land. Maybe you have a well or something that you're going to dig right here. That's, that would be your irrigation. It's not going to be complex, though. I saw Bethany's hand first. Yes?
Do you know what culture did the Three Sisters thing? Like where they planted their crops in like a mound. Like they had like legumes on the bottom, like the bottom side, and then
What
they
is
had
it?
like
A
squash in the
population,
middle.
yeah.
They had corn on top and like
That's
squash.
probably a technique that was used by many different Native American groups, from the Falkland Islands all the way up to wherever the frozen tundra starts, where you can't, where you can't plant stuff anymore. Yeah, so I mean that's many cultures would do that. Okay, so we're about to come up on the last piece of time that we're using this one, and this one is the next one that we're going to use. Okay, so what do you have to do to make this one ready to use it again?
Clear out all the debris and brush that isn't necessary or can tangle up the crop roots.
Okay, you're going to have to get rid, right, of all the stuff that we just talked about has grown up in that 47 years that you haven't used this. Okay, so there is a technique for this. The vocabulary word is called swidden. It's a description word that you put in front of horticulture. Swidden horticulture, otherwise known as, maybe a phrase that you will know more easily. Yep, Renee got it. Slash and burn. Okay. The reason we use the word swidden instead of slash and burn is because I have just told you that there's very little impact on the environment, permanent impact on the environment, but doesn't that sound violent and harsh?
It does.
This is literally what's happening, but it misleads people to think that it's damaging to the environment when it's not, okay? Fire is a naturally occurring thing, right? Like wildfires that we hear about all the time in this country, right? And of course we want to try to control them because we have a human population that it impacts. But fires are part of the natural cycle that replenish the land and enable certain plants to grow. And so what you're going to do is, while you are producing food in this land that your village is eating, maybe as soon as you started using this plot, maybe you're going to use this plot for 5 years. And so on day one that you planted stuff, some of the men, instead of going here and cultivating the land, they go over here because they know in 5 years this is going to have to be ready for a day one also. So, and it's hard work because you don't have chainsaws, you don't have beasts of burden to help you, you don't have an ox that you cut a tree down, it's a huge tree, and you're going to tie it to the ox and make the ox pull it out of there. You are going to go in here and you're going to harvest stuff that you need, like you were talking about, permanent settlements, right? You're going to harvest some of the wood, and you're not going to just burn it all. You're going to harvest what you need and use it for your village. You're going to get bows and arrow equipment that you need out of here, right? You're going to get branches and things that you need for mattresses and mats and things like this that you use. You're going to get thatching for roofs. You're going to use all this stuff. You're not just going to cut it, leave it, burn it. You're going to use all the resources that you can get. You're going to displace a lot of animals. You're going to kill them if you can and eat them, right? And the animals have someplace else to go because there's very similar trees right here, and there's very similar trees, right? Maybe in a little less growth. They've been growing a little shorter period of time. But yeah, so while this is in production for the 3 or 5 years or whatever, this is being readied for production. Swidden horticulture. You let land lie fallow while you're producing from, you have production land someplace else. Letting land lie fallow means it goes back to nature. going back to nature puts a whole bunch of stuff on there that you're going to have to get rid of the next time you need it. Slash and burn whatever it is you're not going to use for whatever thing you need in your village. You are going to burn it. Tree stumps, you're going to burn it. Grasses and things that aren't, necessary for baskets or mattresses or whatever is part of your cultural habits, you're going to burn it. Ash, when you burn this kind of stuff, not when you're burning plastics and chemicals and stuff like that some of us might burn in a backyard fire. But when you're burning natural stuff, the ash that is left over is fantastic fertilizer, y'all. Fantastic fertilizer. You don't have the blue miracle grow, but you got something much better. And then after it's burned, working the soil, making it soft again, works that ash all through there, and you got the best stuff to grow plants for your next 5, 10 years, however long your time is. You got the best soil you could imagine. It's a whole heck of a lot of work. You got the best soil you can imagine. Yes, sir.
So as you were saying earlier, with the crop rotation being something that they did based on the agricultural technique, but I mean, if they didn't do
Well, it's a horticulture technique too, but yeah.
Horticulture technique.
Yeah.
But I mean, diverging water away also seems like a very basic one. So if there are actual,
They would probably do that. They would probably do a little bit rainwater reclamation. Maybe maybe digging a little bit of a depression here so that more rainwater collects or something. In that when you're using that land. Yeah, you're going to do that kind of thing, but it's very little environmental. You're not going to build permanent canals from here up. You're not going to build and maintain a canal system just so you can have these things in production once every 50 years, right? In agriculture, you would. You would build a permanent canal system. As a matter of fact, in New Mexico and Arizona, archaeologists have found extremely complex canal systems that the Hopi built during their empire that they had there during the height of their agricultural production. And there's a ton of really complex canal systems because they needed it for the kind of production that they were engaged in. Yeah. Is your hand up? No? Okay. Alrighty. So, okay. So, make sure, I don't remember writing it on the board, but make sure that you know that even though all of this is happening, and that's part of a day in the life of a horticulturalist, women have a part in this also, because you are feeding all of the workers, and you are probably using all of this area for hunting and gathering techniques or hunting and gathering activities, while the men, are doing these kinds of things. And so I want to emphasize that because remember in Project 3, I'm going to give you a description. Here is an event that happened. And you are going to need to be able to look at the activities that I describe in that scenario and determine with your notes from each of the 5 subsistence strategies, determine, which one of the subsistence strategies would somebody do those behaviors in, right? Okay, so let me make sure that I've got everything on your list that you need for this. Somebody run down, tell me what the list is. What have I erased already and told y'all about?
males and families have separated.
So we talked about social stratification with gender.
Relatively small communities.
Relatively small communities,
Males.
but bigger. The communities are smaller,
Yeah.
but they are bigger than foraging usually allows
Well, they're not
for,
the
and
30.
they're sedentary.
Well, they're not the 30 maximum.
Yeah, 30 or 50. Yeah, they're not the 30 to 50 population density nomadic group. They are 150
We're no-
250.
We're no longer a camp.
We're no longer temporary camps. We are sedentary villages. What else?
Crop
Yeah, crop rotation might be one of the ways
Well,
that you.
I didn't mean to say crop
No, but
rotation.
but it is. Crop rotation would be one of the ways that you would have limited environmental impact. It would be one of the ways. The land is fallow, which means everything grows back. It means there's a lot of manpower work that has to be done, and manpower is the correct word here. It's not a sexist word anyway, but it does so happen to apply to the way the social stratification works in here. right? The men are doing the bulk of the laborious tasks that have to do with food production. There's hand tools, there's no beasts of burden, no complex fertilizer, no complex irrigation techniques, slash and burn, which is not destructive to the environment. Okay, it destroys the vegetation and the animal life in this one little area, but it's not permanent, and it's not going to, completely change the climactic cycle like the Dust Bowl did in the United States back in the early 20th century.
So we'd also mastered like making fire by this point.
Do what?
So we'd also mastered like producing fire on a
Oh yeah, on an at will basis. Oh yeah, that was tens of thousands of years before that. Yes.
No ownership of land.
There's no ownership of land. Good. There's no ownership of land. The community owns the land. You might have little bit of, depending upon what your social structure is like within the village, you might have individual housing, like his family.
Personal space, basically.
Yeah, like you might be able to say, okay, well, this house is the Smith house, and this house is the Jones house. Like you might have that kind of understanding of, I still wouldn't use the word ownership, understanding of personal use of a space or items, but land ownership, no. You have a general understanding that here's the boundary of the land that your community has to have access to in order to survive. Food does not have a price tag. Food is seen as something. So for instance, if a particular family at a particular point in time has men that are way too old to be productive in these activities and way too young to be productive in these activities, the men who are working in these activities do not withhold food from that family because you weren't able to put in, 8 hours of work because you did before when those men were younger, and you will in the next generation when these boys are old enough, right? And so there's no concept of, well, you didn't put in the work, and so I'm not going to give you the food, y'all are just going to have to beg me for whatever's left over. No. There's not that
The mentality of those
mentality.
Those who don't work don't eat.
Yeah, there's not the mentality of whoever is not going to work is not going to eat. Because there's always work to do, and the old guys are teaching the young guys how to do the work of, and they're making the tools, and they're doing, it's different.
It's no longer a true egalitarian society.
You're right, it is not an egalitarian society anymore because men do have superiority over females here because their work is directly related to the most important thing in life: access to calories, production of calories for the village. That's the vital work that needs to be done. And men are doing it, so they have a higher social position than women.
Even though we're now horticulture, we're still hunting and gathering like as needed.
Hunting and gathering or foraging is part of all of the other subsistence strategy. It stands alone as the oldest, and it's also part of a supplemental approach to calories for all the others. You're right. Okay, so questions. Look at your list in foraging really quick and see if there's anything that you don't have, like a related item from horticulture about. Does that make sense? you want to, okay. Like if we talked about social stratification and foraging, I want to make sure and talk about it in horticulture. I know we did that one. So look back through and see, did we talk about population density? I remember doing that. We talked about sedentary versus nomadicism. We talked about that. We talked about the degree of manipulation or not of the land or the environment. We talked about ownership concepts. Is there anything else that we talked about in foraging that we did not mention here, or vice versa?
I mean, we talked about agricultural techniques. And
No, don't use the word agriculture. This has nothing to do with agriculture. This is called horticulture. Agriculture is a different subsistence strategy that has a completely different description to it. Horticulture is not agriculture. Horticulture is the day in the life and the life ways that we just described here. And agriculture has the word crop associated with it. It has the word beast of burden associated with it. It has the word environment associated with it. But the way that these things are used and considered and thought of is extremely different than horticulture. So please make sure that you keep the word agriculture separate from horticulture in your mind. It's one of those things that we have to unlearn, like we talked about on Monday, whenever that was. You have to unlearn so many things that we think of. So unlearn agriculture in terms of this. Yes? Oh, okay. Yes, so foragers are seen to be, very, very leisure time oriented society. There's much less leisure time here because you have more people to take care of, and the work is extensive, right? And I've used an example here that is like flat land and trees and stuff. You can be a horticulturalist, and I think that there's an example of a culture in your textbook that you'll read about. You can live in the mountains, in the Himalayan mountains someplace, and be a horticulturalist. You have a different way of dealing with what you're going, you can have maybe like little terraced areas on on a plateau in the middle of the mountains or something, where that's flat, that has enough soil that you can grow potatoes or something in Peru, or and be a horticulturalist. So I've used this flatland example, but you can be a horticulturalist in pretty much any environment that has arable soil. Y'all know that word, arable land? Arable means you can produce plants in it. Arable land. So horticulture is a subsistence strategy that can only happen for you. It can only happen if you live someplace where land is arable. Okay? Pastoralism, that we're going to talk about on Monday, is another organization. It's another social structure organization with different customs, different traditions, different symbols, different life ways, different food sources, different calorie sources for your main source of calories for society. Pastoralism is a subsistence strategy that is an adaptation. Remember the word adaptation? Adaptation is the cultural ways that you develop. Using your wits, you develop it so that you can exist in whatever environment that you have. So pastoralism is the third item on our list that we'll talk about on Monday, and it is a subsistence strategy where arable land is not available. There's a ton of land on the Earth's surface where you cannot grow crops. Maybe it's too dry, maybe it's too sandy, maybe it's too something, right? Too cold or something, right? For stuff to grow. You could not be a successful forager there, nor could you entirely exist on foraging, nor could you be a successful horticulturalist there. There's still land, and people are still people. We're very smart, and we're going to figure out a way to make the land work for us anyway. We'll eat something that the land can provide to us. Okay, I think we did it then. I think we did with horticulture. So remember, try to unlearn everything you think you know about our modern way of putting food in our bellies, to try to figure out these descriptions. Okay, so I'll see y'all on Monday.